The Edmonton Oilers are betting favorites to take home the Stanley Cup, to win the Pacific Division, but they might get off to a slow start this year.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So today's show, I'm going to walk you through the stages of contemplation and preparation. I am always of the opinion going into a season, you want to set your expectations at a reasonable level. When you are the betting favorite to win the Stanley Cup, when you're probably the favorite, when you are the favorite to win your division, expectations are going to be high. Today's episode is about mentally preparing yourself for the possibility and the likely possibility that the early stages of this upcoming Oilers season might be a bit bumpy. So our first segment, we are going to tackle the roster turnover, finding fits, who plays with who, dealing with that. The second segment, we are going to deal with the physical outcomes, dealing with the fact that the season only ended 2.5 months ago, that the team had some roster turnover, that there are some guys with some lingering, nagging injuries from last season that need to be accounted for. And then our final segment, we're going to tackle the outside, what happens to the teams around the Oilers, what could put the Oilers in a difficult position in regards to that. So let's start with this. We all know last season did not get off to a great start. We know that coming into the season, Mattias Ekholm was a little bit dinged up, didn't get off to a great start in the regular season. Team as a whole was not in great shape out of the gate. They, once again, after a solid preseason, they went back to Jack Campbell, and Jack Campbell was not great out of the gate, frankly. We can all be honest about that. And eventually back to Stuart Skinner as the full-time starter. But I think a lot of people, and I'm guilty of this as well, we all are looking at the end goal and the expectation. The end goal is to win the Stanley Cup. The expectations are to be a genuine Stanley Cup contender that has the goods to be the last team standing. There is a lot that needs to happen between now, the end of September, and the middle to end of June next summer, when the Oilers could potentially be raising the Stanley Cup. To make it all happen, there are a lot of moving parts. And I want to start here because when you go into a season with roster turnover, everybody just assumes everything's going to click right away. And when you have players as talented as the Oilers do, when you have McDavid, you have Draisaitl, you have Hyman, you have Nugent-Hopkins, you have Bouchard, you have Ekholm, you feel that you can fiddle around with the supporting cast. You can turn Warren Fogle into Victor Arvidsson. You could turn Dylan Holloway into Jeff Skinner. You can tinker around. You can move guys on your back end. You can turn Cody Ceci into Ty Emberson, that type of deal. Those guys on their own as individuals are talented hockey players. I think Jeff Skinner is going to work well. I think Victor Arvidsson is going to work well. I think Ty Emberson is actually going to work pretty well. The question becomes, how do we get the best out of them as quickly as possible? How do we identify what they can bring to the team that we need? And where does it go in our lineup? Finding fits is tricky because so much of hockey is instinctual. It is read and react. It is making something happen within the confines of the system, the environment. You might want to get the puck from point A to point B, but there's a defender in the way, there's a stick in the way, I can't get there skating it, so I have to figure out what I can do offensively. And so much of hockey comes down to feel. Feel is something that's hard to manufacture. If guys don't click, if they don't work well together, there's not really a way to fugazi that. You can't facsimile that. It's tricky because the only way to get experience, the only way to get comfort with each other is to play. And because you're not in a position where you can simulate game environment in practice or in preseason games, it's really hard to get guys up to game speed. We talked about it last year that it took Mattias Ekholm a few weeks to get himself up to game speed because he was injured during the preseason. So he didn't have the proper ramp up time. And a lot of people misunderstand what the preseason is for when you're a good team. For the most part, preseason is about getting your guys in shape. If you are a team like the Oilers, the Rangers, the Bruins, the Canucks, the Lightning, the Panthers, if you are genuinely a good team, you have high expectations. You're not auditioning a lot of guys for spots on your roster. You're not auditioning a top 6 forward. You're not auditioning a top 4 defenseman. You are using the preseason to iron out who's playing with who and to have your guys ready to hit the ground running as soon as the season starts. And finding that level of mental commitment, it's difficult. And as we sit here, the Oilers are probably going to start the preseason with 3 new defensemen. Ekholm and Bouchard are locked in. Brett Kulak is locked in. Right now, there is speculation that Darnell Nurse is going to miss the start of the preseason, and he may miss start of the regular season. Not sure yet on the recovery timeline, but there's a good chance he's going to miss some of the preseason. So the guy who needs minutes, who needs to get himself ramped up to have a good bounce back season, he's not starting the season on time. And even if he starts the regular season on time, he's not going to have the few weeks of training camp and the preseason to really be as ready to go as he could possibly be. He needs the familiarity with whoever his new partner is going to be, whether it's Emberson, whether it's Stetcher. Losing those reps because of an injury, that is challenging for a team to overcome. You don't have Cody Ceci at all anymore. You don't have Philip Broberg anymore at all. You don't have Vincent Desharnais. So you are looking, as we sit here on September 24th, on September 16th, don't mind me. Words are hard. My brain is a mess. I have to do 4 podcasts today. We sit here on September 16th. There's a good chance you are looking at an Oilers top 6. Depth chart-wise, that is Ekholm Bouchard, that is Travis Dermott and Ty Emberson, and then Brett Kulak and Troy Stetcher. That is a lot of turnover for one offseason. Those guys, even if that's not going to be your final 6, the Oilers are going to have injuries. They're going to play Josh Brown at some point. They are going to probably play Philip Kemp at some point. They are probably going to trade for a defenseman in season to push their ceiling higher. But they have to get there first. And it is a challenge to navigate the length of a season without having your guys in the best possible position to succeed. And that's really the key here. The preseason training camp, it's about ramping your guys up, getting them locked in for the journey. It is a marathon, not a sprint. The NHL regular season is very long. There are highs, there are lows, and that's what we're going to talk about coming up next in the second segment of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around where we've got your team covered every day. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, now we have a little something different for you. Through December 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. NFL was crazy yesterday. The Cardinals absolutely stomped out the Rams. The Chiefs and their 9 lives once again outlasted the Bengals. The Giants lost to the Washington Commanders. The Ravens lost to the Raiders. Tonight, we got the Falcons going to Philly to take on the Birds. The Eagles 5.5-point favorites. Thursday night football, the Patriots going to MetLife Stadium. 6.5-point underdogs to Aaron Rodgers and the Jets. Sunday afternoon, Giants and Browns, Colts and Bears, Texans and Vikings. Don't sleep on the Vikings, who have looked really good through the first 2 weeks of the NFL season. If you want to get in on the action, go visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we start to ramp back up for hockey season, 5 episodes a week. all the podcasting platforms, over on YouTube, where our audience is just, we are doing numbers over there on YouTube. Since I took over the show at the middle of April, we have doubled the subscriber count on YouTube. When I took over, it was around 800. Right now, we're over 1,600 subscribers on YouTube. So if you're part of the community, give yourself a pat on the back. Thank you to the people who make the show go. As I always say about any content, you can do a great job, but if your audience doesn't care, if you're not engaging your audience, it doesn't matter, because then no one's listening. It's like a tree falling in the forest if no one's around. Yeah, it makes a sound, but if no one hears it, it doesn't matter. So this is a concept I'm about to talk about that sounds a bit like fortune cookie wisdom. That sounds like Facebook wisdom, but stay with me. Adversity builds teams. If teams don't face difficult situations, they're not prepared. When you're not prepared for those difficult situations, you are not as prepared as you can be. The most obvious examples we can point to in the hockey space are the teams that win the President's Trophy running away. The Rangers last year, I don't think fall into that box exactly, but it can be semi-applied. The year before that, the Bruins, they break the regular season record for points. That absolutely applies. That Bruins team faced no adversity all regular season, got to the playoffs against the Panthers, were up in that series, and then lose Game 6 and Game 7. You talk about the Lightning in 2019 getting swept by the Columbus Blue Jackets. That was a team that had not faced regular season adversity all year, and the first time they really got challenged, they got thumped in the mouth. They got knocked out in 4 games by the Columbus Blue Jackets. That's the only series the Blue Jackets have ever won in the history of their franchise and the actual playoffs. We're not counting the bubble playoffs where they beat the Leafs and then lost to the Lightning in the first round of the playoffs proper. Preparing for this type of season is challenging. When the expectations are this high, it breeds a sense of entitlement. Guys coming off of losing the Stanley Cup final in 7 games, they don't feel it is hard to stay locked in as long as an NHL season is. I'm going to say this to you and you're going to laugh, but you think about, when was the last time you went to work, you went to school, and you were entirely engaged the entire time? The entire time. You didn't daydream, you didn't check your phone, you didn't stare out the window, you didn't check the clock, you didn't go over to someone else's desk to talk. When you are in this type of environment, and we forget how long the season goes if you're going to be there all the way to the end. We're in the middle of September and informal captain skates have started. There's a world where you're doing hockey activities September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. The Oilers just did it. There is a world where the Oilers could conceivably 2 years in a row be doing hockey activities 10 months out of the year. That is a long time to stay entirely locked in. And as far as entitlement, what I mean by that, it's an attitude and it is a mindset. You see this a lot from teams that go on a deep playoff run and then come back the next year. The most obvious one I can think of, and this is because I can personally apply my experiences to it, are the Rangers of 2 and 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, the Rangers go to the conference final against the Lightning about a year ahead of schedule. They probably weren't supposed to be there yet. They were probably a little bit ahead, but they got to the conference final. They were reasonably close to going up 3-1 in that series. They end up losing in 6. They come back the next year. Their chests are all puffed out. We're going back. Everybody on that team came back the following season with the mindset of, oh, the regular season's easy. We know how to do this now. All we got to do is get to the playoffs. We'll turn the light on and we'll be dominant like we were. We will find a way because we did it before. And that experience, though valuable, at points can become overconfidence. And that's the key here. You don't want confidence to bleed over into overconfidence. Every professional athlete has a baseline level of confidence. You know, those guys are who they are because of their experiences. They've been the best player on their team pretty much their entire life until they've got to upper junior, upper college, or the NHL. Most NHL guys have always been the best player on their own team. And because of that, you get that cocky sense of confidence that you can do anything. And that's important. You know, I always talk about how confidence matters almost as much as talent. You can see mediocre players do something crazy if they believe in themselves enough. On a team-wide level, though, when a team feels we got this, that's when you start to get worried, because that's when guys stop forechecking as hard. That's when defensemen stop breaking out as cleanly. That's when people start to get lazy because they feel, oh, we did it before, we can do it again. And while, yes, that is true, when you start getting into that sense of confidence where it becomes a sense of entitlement that, well, we're going to do this because we're going to the cup final. We're winning the cup. It is really a long ways away. We are 7 months away from the start of the NHL playoffs, and a lot can happen between now and then. You need your team as ready as possible for the ups and downs. I want to wrap up this segment with this perspective. The Oilers last year faced serious adversity almost immediately out of the gate. They fire Jay Woodcroft in November. Chris Knobloch comes in. They go on a heater. They rattle off a 16 in a row. They rattle off an 8 in a row. Then they get themselves in the playoffs. They come back from 3-2 down against the Canucks. They outlast the Dallas Stars. They drag themselves from 3-1 down in the Stanley Cup final to 1 goal away from winning the whole thing. Last year's team was defined by its ability to answer to adversity. Great teams are able to answer to adversity, whether it's injuries, whether it's underperformance, whether it's bad coaching. Great teams are able to respond. They roll with the punches. They don't get too high when they're winning. They don't get too low when they're losing. Great teams are able to keep it even keel of always being able to meet the moment, because if they're too high, they're going to go into overconfidence. If they're too low, that's how you lose 8 games in a row and get your coach fired, like what happened last year. The Oilers were not as bad as they played out of the gate last year. That's just the way the game was going for them. And because of that, they needed something to change up the energy. And a lot of this conversation today on this episode has been centered around stuff that isn't exactly tangible. It's really stuff you're only going to get an understanding of if you're watching every night and you are being detailed. If you are watching the breakouts, if you are watching the forechecks, if you are watching the zone entries, that is where you can see where a team is at. If it looks clean, if they're moving the puck, if they're getting where they need to, and the puck's just not going in, over the course of a long season, the puck will start to go in. 1-2 games of that, it happens. Good goalie, other team, just weird bounces. You know, hockey's like that. Hockey is a bounce-based sport. It is the most luck-dependent sport of the 4 major North American sports. So we're going to take one more quick break. We're going to come back, and we're going to mentally prepare ourselves for the upcoming Edmonton Oilers season. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are tackling the mental hurdles of getting prepared for an NHL season. And look, this might be me preemptively trying to not get my hopes up, because all of my teams have always done this to me, where I expect great things because of the season they just had, and then they come out and lay an egg the following year. So my logic for this episode is covering our bases. I think the Oilers are going to be very good this year. I think the Oilers probably are going to win the division this year. I think they'll have a good chance of winning the entire Western Conference, because the Central is so compressed, and Nashville and Colorado and Winnipeg and Minnesota and Dallas, they're all going to beat up on each other, and that'll keep those teams a little bit closer in the standings. Whereas Edmonton, I don't want to come out and be too confident this early, but other than Vancouver, Vegas is very top heavy. They don't have a goalie I really believe in. Adin Hill is fine, but Vegas is a fragile team. The Kings, the Oilers have handled the Kings enough where I'm not worried about the Kings. I don't think Seattle, I don't think Calgary, I don't think either of the Southern California teams, the Sharks or the Ducks, are going to be a factor. It is going to come down to, can the Oilers be better than the Canucks if they want to win the division? The winner of this division the last 4 or 5 years has had at least 109 standings points. The Oilers over under today, as of recording, is 106.5. I think the Oilers absolutely can clear that number. If they are going to win the division, they are almost certainly going to clear that number. I would like to say the Oilers are in a strong position to really make something special happen this year. But they do have a lot of uncertainty on their roster. And that defense, man, I keep coming back to that defense. And just when you have 3 out of the 6 guys uncertain, with Nurse injured to start the season, and even if he doesn't miss the start of the regular season, the fact he's missing training camp and preseason to ramp up, it's a cause for concern. I want Nurse to bounce back. I want nothing more than Darnell Nurse to play up to his contract, because when he's been able to, he's a solid hockey player. The key for me, and this is going to sound weird again, but I want to see the Oilers find a way. I want to see the Oilers find a way to put Nurse in a position to succeed. Because if Darnell Nurse has a bounce back season, this Oilers team really might be ready for the bright lights. And it is very presumptive to be talking about playoff issues in September. But let's be frank. If the Oilers miss the playoffs this year, it is an unmitigated disaster. And you might be saying, well, Nick, how could they miss the playoffs? Okay. You come out of the gate a little slow because you're integrating so many new pieces. You got to put in 3 new forwards, at least 2 new defensemen, and everyone needs time to play with each other, to figure out who's going to play with who. You assume McDavid and Draisaitl will be fine, but remember, McDavid came out of the gate last year a little bit slow. He missed a couple of games. He himself said he probably trained a little bit too hard in the offseason and wasn't as physically ready for the regular season as he needed to be, because he had worked so hard in the offseason to kind of, I don't want to say fine-tune, but he pushed himself too hard in the offseason, and he was a little bit fatigued to start the year. He has said, I dialed it back. I feel a lot more energized. I feel a lot better coming into this upcoming season. And you would think it makes sense, considering the season was a month longer this year than it was last year. He had more time to kind of he had more time last summer to get himself ready, which made him feel like, well, I could keep pushing. I still have more time. Whereas this summer, shorter summer, of course, he got married. That's a big deal. He got married, went on his honeymoon. That type of layoff is good. McDavid needs to be as locked in as any human being has ever been locked in ahead of an NHL season. This is not quite the child who was chosen type deal, but McDavid feels the weight and the burden of these expectations around him. You think about how close they got last year. You think about him winning a Conn Smythe on a team that lost in the Stanley Cup final. That is going to be a man possessed this year. I, for one, am excited, but I am nervous to see what he's able to put together this year. I want to say the path is relatively simple. You win the division, you play probably LA, maybe Vegas, or Nashville, or Winnipeg in the first round. The Oilers should be in good shape to play any of those 4 teams. Then in the second round, you play Vancouver, you play LA, you play Vegas. They should be able to beat any of those teams. Then you play Dallas, you play Colorado, you play Nashville, you play Winnipeg. The Oilers will be reasonably favored against all of those teams. Look at the odds right now. That's all I got to say. The Oilers are expected to be great this year. The public is in on them. They are a public team, which means that even if people aren't the most proficient or knowledgeable or studied bettors, they know who the Oilers are. They know they have McDavid and Draisaitl, and people are more likely to bet on them because people are more familiar with them, which creates a mob mentality type deal where even if the team maybe isn't as good as their line or their odds are, that does mean that people, because they're familiar with them, are more likely to bet on them. Doesn't necessarily mean that Doesn't necessarily mean the number associated with them on their odds, whether it's for points or the division or to win the Stanley Cup, is the most precise, but it's where the sports book is able to get the most action on. So before we wrap up, the last thing I want to get in on this subject matter, getting to the playoffs alone is hard. Even when the team is this good, even when the expectations are this high, just making the playoffs is challenging. You have to accept that. To get there, it takes a lot. You're going to have to win 45 games of your 82. That doesn't seem like a lot, but you need to win at least 45 in regulation. That gets you to 90. Then, if you're going to afford yourself some grace, we'll say 8 or 9 loser points, losing in overtime. That gets you in the playoffs. 98, 99 points, that'll get you in. If you want to win the division, you're going to have to push 50 wins. That'll get you to 100, and then your loser points should push you over the finish line as far as the calculus for winning the division. Then the calculus changes. Then it becomes about who can get hotter for a short period of time. You don't need to be better. You just need to play better. And the Oilers are going to be in a position where they have so many opportunities. They are going to improve this roster. They are going to get a performance from somebody nobody's expecting. Maybe it's Stetcher. Maybe it's Emerson. Maybe it's Matthew Savoie. Maybe it's Jeff Skinner. Maybe it's Victor Arvidsson. Maybe McDavid pushes 160 points. Maybe Draisaitl has 60 goals. Maybe Darnell Nurse bounces back and has a strong season after he gets surgery and feels better. All of that is on the table, but what makes it fun and why sports are the best, we got to play the games to find out. We won't know. We'll start to be able to make conclusions after a month or so, but until we start playing actual regular season NHL games, you won't know. I am trying to set you up for success, preparing yourself for the stress, preparing yourself to cope. It's an important part of being a good sports fan. That'll do it for today's episode of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, join the community. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. But before we get out of here, thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen today. Now for your second listen, go find Locked On NHL, where the local experts keep you updated daily on all the biggest storylines ahead of the big NHL season. Find Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Talk to you guys tomorrow.